Okay, I'd like to begin our event for this evening. My name is Eugenia Lean, and I'm the director at the Weatherhead East Asian Institute, and I'm very happy to welcome you all here on behalf of Columbia and the Weatherhead for this event, Asian Views on America's Role in Asia. This event we are co-sponsoring with SEPA, the APEC Study Center, and the Asia Foundation. And it is turning out to be an obviously, when we planned this earlier in the summer, we didn't quite realize how vital such an event will be. And indeed, I think given some of the stunning results from the election last week, this kind of gathering is extremely crucial. The evening event has gathered representatives from the Asian Foundation to discuss a report that was released yesterday. Asian Views on America's Role in Asia is the title. And this document represents a policy recommendation for the incoming administration on issues most important to three of Asia's subregions: Northeast Asia, South Asia, and Southeast Asia. The event is organized so that contributors to the report will be dialoguing with academics in the New York area. And I think we look forward to a very critical and spirited discussion and dialogue on what U.S. foreign policy in Asia will be as we move forward with this new presidency. I think the election results have resulted in a great deal of uncertainty. I think our new president-elect has strong opinions. I'm not sure how well crafted or informed they are yet. They will indeed need, my sense is that as the presidency, the transition moves forward, the input from the Asia Foundation's report will indeed be extremely critical. I think it's also a time for the academic community and the policy community to remain very vigilant, to insist on being heard, and to advise prudence as we move forward rather than rash action. And I think tonight's gathering is going to be only the beginning. We have an extremely wonderful lineup of experts, and given I was told explicitly that we have a limited amount of time, so I'm not going to spend too much time on opening remarks. And I'm not going to go over each individual's bio. I believe those have been passed out, so please do go over the individual bios as the speakers make their presentations. I think what I'm going to do now is turn the podium over to David Arnold, who I will briefly introduce. David Arnold is the president and the CEO of the Asia Foundation. He has years of experience across Asia Pacific and the Middle East. I believe he's the 6th president of the Asia Foundation and has previously served as the president of the American University in Cairo. He has also worked in the Ford Foundation and indeed is a frequent public speaker on issues of governance and development in the Asia Pacific. And I'd like to welcome David, who will, I think, introduce the report to all of us. Okay.
Well, thanks very much for the warm welcome and kind introduction. I want to start by expressing the Foundation's thanks and appreciation to the Weatherhead Institute and to its director, Eugenia Lean. Thank you very much. I also have to share with you that this event would not have happened without a summer conversation with Dean Marigiano, where I shared with her what we were up to in terms of the preparation of this report, and said, would there be any interest here at Columbia in organizing an event around the time of the release? And I think she picked up the ball and ran with it, and I want to thank her for her support of the idea. And she's, the collaboration that has taken place, I think, has been very, very heartening. So let me give a little bit of background on the report. First of all, to let you know that this report is actually the fifth in a series of quadrennial reports that the Foundation has commissioned over the years, starting in 1992, in preparation for a new administration, to really ask a question about the U.S. role in Asia and what are the most critical issues for US-Asia relations, and what are the directions and the recommendations that people from the region feel would make sense for an incoming administration and a new Congress. And as Professor Lean has noted with last week's election, in many ways this report provides a very timely opportunity for Asian voices to be heard in the U.S. on the subject of US-Asia relations. We also hope that it will help to stimulate discussions in the region among both established and emerging Asian leaders on Asia's future and on the U.S. role in helping to realize that future. The recommendations in the report are intended to help inform the thinking of the next administration, and also to provide input for foreign policy committees in the Congress. And I think the way in which the report was framed was really thinking beyond the rebalance or the pivot to Asia. What comes next? There are a couple of aspects in which this is a rather unique report. There are a lot of policy studies that are coming out now from various think tanks giving advice to the new administration in terms of foreign policy. But this one actually draws on the perspectives of experts across Asia. We helped organize 3 separate workshops in Northeast Asia, Southeast Asia, and South Asia that were held in April, May of this year, drawing on think tank experts, former government officials, civil society leaders from the various countries across the region. In most cases, we were able to get 2 or 3 representatives from each of the countries in the sub-region to participate in those workshops. And the 3 chairs of those subgroups are here and will be presenting the findings and the recommendations from their subgroup this evening. They have shown remarkable dedication because not only did they work with our staff, John Brandon, our Senior Director for International Relations, to frame the issues and arrange presentations by experts at each of these workshops, but they then took on the difficult challenge of trying to synthesize and distill the views and the recommendations, which were coming from very disparate sources, into a readable 10 to 12 page summary that is included in the volume. They then have committed to come to the U.S. to meet with a task force of U.S. experts on U.S.-Asia relations that we convened here in New York at the Pucanico Conference Center in June of this year. So they made one trip to the U.S. For that purpose and are here for this entire week doing a traveling roadshow between Washington, New York, and San Francisco to help share the findings and the recommendations from their various regions. The second thing that is somewhat unique about this particular report is that for the first time we decided that we needed to reach out to a new up-and-coming generation of younger analysts. Not that these are not fresh, young folks that are presenting tonight. They're all extremely useful in their views and their outlooks. But we wanted to get the next generation. And so we actually commissioned 3 young scholars from Pakistan, Cambodia, and China to write and share their reflections on a longer-term view of where Asia is going and what the U.S. role should be in helping to realize that future. So instead of looking at a presidential election cycle, we asked them to think 15 to 20 years down the road and say, you know, where do they see the region going? What are the critical issues and challenges facing their respective subregions? And in what ways should the U.S. be helpful in trying to address some of those challenges? So we're really delighted that we have our 3 Asian chairs here who have been helping us to release the report. And we're also delighted to have Dr. Ellen Frost, who is the Senior Advisor and Fellow at the East-West Center in Washington and who served as a member of the project's U.S. task force. I should give credit also to the U.S. co-chairs, Dr. Harry Harding, who's a university professor at the University of Virginia, and Ellen Lapson, President Emeritus of the Stimson Center, who served as co-chairs of the U.S. task force. And as was mentioned by Dr. Lean, bios are in your flyer. Each of our panelists has an extremely impressive academic and professional background, and I think you will find their views extremely thoughtful and stimulating. So thank you so much for joining us this evening. And with that, I think I'm turning it over to Professor Nathan.
Are you really? Or are you turning it over to Professor Yoon? I'm fine. Aren't you going to present your thoughts first and then I'll comment? I can comment. Yeah, go ahead, you do. Yeah. Thank you very much. It's my great pleasure to have this important opportunity to make a few comments on the future U.S. policy from Northeast Asian perspective. I'd like to make brief comments on 3 points. First, on economic policy of the Trump administration in the future. In the last 70 years, Northeast Asian countries could grow rapidly in terms of their own economies, and it was mainly possible through U.S. commitment to economic liberalism, emphasizing the importance of free flow of goods and capital. So naturally, Northeast Asia wants continued U.S. commitments to economic liberalism rather than succumbing to the temptation of protectionism. Protectionist policy may not help the United States in increasing domestic jobs, especially in the manufacturing sector. The loss of jobs in the American manufacturing sector might have been caused by other factors like development of advanced technologies and application of those advanced technologies in production process like computerization or automation or something like that. So protectionist policy may not be a solution for that problem. Also, we had better think about our past experience. For example, in the 1930s, when President Herbert Hoover signed the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act in 1930, U.S. trading partners began to retaliate in a matter of several months, and we know what happened later. So we hope that kind of bad experience would not repeat again. Naturally, Northeast Asian countries want U.S. continuous commitment to the idea of TPP, but we are not sure whether that will be possible or not. But even in case the U.S. desert the idea of TPP, in that case, probably Japan will be able to take a more important role in leading TPP idea, even without the U.S. participation. Because TPP without U.S. will be better than nothing, in the sense that it will be able to stabilize economic relationship in the Asia Pacific. And who knows? I mean, President Trump may think twice about the effectiveness of protectionist policies in 2 or 3 years. So I think Japan may be able to exercise a more important role in shaping international relations in Northeast Asia. I don't know whether the more important role of Japan will be also applicable in the security field. I mean, that's an important question in the future. But on the issue of security policy of the Trump administration, Northeast Asia wants continued commitment of the U.S. because we don't have effective institutional mechanism for security cooperation in that region. This is unique in the sense that, for example, Southeast Asia has its own institutional mechanisms. Europe also has similar mechanisms. But in Northeast Asia, we don't have it. So the relationship, international relations in that region is ripe with so-called security dilemma problem. This is why we need continued U.S. commitment in terms of security affairs. If there is no security commitment of the U.S. in that region, probably South Korea or Japan will search for the nuclear option, and nuclearization of those countries will lead to more unstable security relations there, which will lead to more unstable economic relations. And in turn, that will lead to the reduction of economic transaction between the United States and Northeast Asia, which may not help, for example, in creating American domestic jobs. So I think prudent but active engagement in that region rather than isolation will serve the American interests there. One alternative option for the U.S. to reduce the cost of security commitment in that region may be establishing a kind of multilateral security cooperative mechanism there. Because if we can establish some kind of rules or principles and norms in terms of international behavior in that region, that will contribute in stabilizing international security relations there. So trying to build a multilateral mechanism there, I think that may be one way of reducing cost of U.S. commitment in that region. Probably U.S. policymakers may be imaginative and try to separate East Asian politics from the European context and then bring Russia into the East Asian politics, leave some room for Russia to contribute positively in one way or another. Finally, North Korean nuclear issue is becoming more and more imminent threat to U.S. American security, and there is not that many options available for us, for the U.S. as well as Korea and Japan. So probably continuing to apply strong sanction against North Korea until North Korean leader change his calculation about the cost and benefit of nuclear option. I think that may be the remaining option as of now. And then probably the U.S. may begin to talk with North Korea about a permanent solution to its nuclear program. However, to achieve the goal of denuclearization, we need to mobilize cooperation from China fully. And that's very important challenge for us. So I think it would be better for the US government to try to separate the North Korean nuclear issue from the general competitive tone of US-China relationship. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So the proposals on Northeast Asia that the group has suggested are very sophisticated and nuanced, and certainly they're wise. I support them. I guess the whole program was carried out with an idea that we would have a more mainstream candidate. I'm participating in another study group that is being run by Orville Schell of the Asia Society and Susan Shirk of UCSD, where we've been studying US-China policy for about a year, and we kind of got to where we expected Hillary to be elected, but earlier on we were, of course, thinking about somebody within the policy mainstream. Now we're facing a very different situation that I think your various meetings didn't anticipate. And I suppose the two great risks that we're worried about in Asia, one is the risk of neglect. We see the new administration well, first of all, the campaign was run on domestic issues, and insofar as Asia was mentioned, it was mentioned as trade, China, trade, jobs, really as a domestic issue and not really as a foreign policy issue. But now as the new administration is taking shape, it is so consumed by its internal struggles and personnel issues and so forth, that I think there's a very large chance that whoever ends up in charge of Asia in the administration won't be able to get the attention of top leaders. And one of the very important recommendations that this report makes that's absolutely correct is that the United States cannot neglect Asia. And one of the achievements that I think you're endorsing tacitly or openly of the Obama administration was to pay more attention to Asia because it's important. So I think one of the great risks going forward is neglect. And the other great risk going forward is a search for simple solutions. I want to say being a bomb thrower, but I don't want that to be taken too literally. But that the new administration would figure, okay, the problem is easy to solve. You raise tariffs, you tell the Japanese that we're walking, I don't know what their idea would be on North Korea, that I suppose a military solution might come to the minds of some of Trump's advisors. South China Sea will build up our Navy and we'll just have, the whole sea will be covered with American ships. There won't be any room for anybody else. Sort of disruptive, simple solution mentalities. That seems to me to be the other risk. And I don't know which is worse. I almost think neglect would be better than creative policy making on the part of the Trump team. And of course, we don't know who they're going to be. There are different rumors out there that it's Peter Navarro, that it's Mike Pillsbury, who's a Columbia PhD. Please forget that. Who is, or James Woolsey. Different people have spoken up about Asia recently, but we really don't know who's going to end up in charge. So in our study group, Asia Society, UCSD, we've sort of wondered, did we waste a year? Is there any use saying anything? However, and you may wonder this as well, you've worked very hard and produced these things, but I think there is room, first of all, because the policy is so indeterminate. Secondly, because the policymakers are going to have to confront reality, and then they're going to be scrambling around for sort of what do we do things, and the fact that various groups have been studying it will perhaps be useful. And in any case, we need to lay down a marker publicly and say these were the wise policies, and that so that future policies can be assessed with respect to that. And I think there's great value in particular in having Asian views, which is what David has said is the special contribution here and what I think we're reading here is Asian views are, yes, we still need the United States in the region. It plays a very important role in strategic stability. we need you to pay attention. Secondly, the complexity of the regional dynamic. It's not just U.S.-Japan, it's not just U.S.-China, it's not, and so forth, but that all these things are very interactive and it's complex, and you have to attend to the secondary and tertiary effects of things that you do. And perhaps thirdly, as Professor Yoon has emphasized, the win-win economically, that you can't just look at job loss and blame it on trade, that there are tremendous gains to all parties from economic interactions, trade, investment, and so forth, the mutual value of it. So I think the report delivers some very important and fundamental messages that perhaps are even more valuable in the light that they aren't just, conventional wisdom within the new administration. So now we go to the right.
South Asia, yeah. You want, yeah. Okay, it's my turn to say something on South Asia. Well, let me say that it's been a very stimulating exercise, and I think it has been a very rewarding opportunity to participate in this study. I wanted to present 4 sets of points to you. The first one, I mean, we've been here for 3 days, and there's gloom and doom everywhere. Certainly, in the East Coast. I mean, I suppose the same is on the West Coast. Given the intensity and the polarization that we saw in the election, is quite natural, I think, where the reaction to the result and the unexpected nature of it. But I believe change is often good. It presents an opportunity to rethink assumptions that guide a certain group of people. I mean, I think consensus can be very deadening sometimes, because when shared understandings prevent you from thinking creatively, and there is groupthink, there is absolute agreement among the main actors, and which constrains the bandwidth, the band in which you can actually debate issues. I think what we've seen in this election, it was not just Mr. Trump has said some very interesting things on international affairs. I mean, you take away his personal character, but some of those issues were also raised by Bernie Sanders. They were also raised by Rand Paul. I mean, as in the Republican Party, and before that, his father in the previous election campaign. There has been both academically the so-called realist section that has been calling for a more measured policy. Those who are arguing that, look, that some of the recent policies were not going to be sustainable. Those set of arguments had actually existed. So therefore, I think this is an opportunity, I would say, to take a fresh look at the U.S. engagement. I think this becomes even more important given the fact that Asia is changing, and the nature of interaction between U.S. and Asia was also going to change. Therefore, I think I would say this is an opportunity to take a fresh look, question many of the assumptions that has brought the U.S. To this point. The second point I wanted to make was on the 3 broad themes that have informed. I mean, it's not direct; not all of them get directly reflected. The first of the theme is that while all of us want the U.S. engagement in the region, we also see that there's some inevitable retrenchment of the American position. That U.S. is not going to be able to do what it has done for the last 70 years in Asia, expansive, massive forward military presence, and the kind of things that the U.S. could do in the last 70 years. They're going to be made difficult by the dramatic transformation that are taking place in Asia, including the rise of China, China's military power. Therefore, some retrenchment is going to be inevitable, and I think the question is how we do that. So how it might happen, I'm not part of that, so it's, as outsiders we just say, look, we're going to look at what the US does. The second aspect is, if retrenchment is inevitable, some rearrangement is necessary. That it's not that US simply leaves, that it is a question of if the US has to stay there, and is there a different way of organizing the American presence, the nature of its relationships, and how it pursues its objectives, which are deeper and more enduring at this point of time. So retrenchment, rearrangement And the third theme that has come through the report is one of restraint. That there's been too much emphasis on values in the US policy towards the region, the idea that US could pursue values without any cost to the pursuit of its interests, that there was no trade-off, that the US was so powerful that after 89 and 91, that there was no cost to doing some things. There's going to be more of it from my colleagues, that can you maintain a good relationship with Thailand even while attacking it or for its military coup, or can you do something in Philippines against the present government without losing something else? So I think those need to rebalance interests and values in the US approach to Asia has become a necessity at this point of time. The third set of issues I wanted to mention was on South Asia. Actually, many people, I see a lot of East Asian faces here, many of them wonder, what is South Asian guy doing here talking about Asia? Because I think a lot of people define, look, you guys are not part of South Asia, I mean, I think, or East Asia. But I think many of these categories actually have been a fairly recent ones. The term Southeast Asia did not exist till the commander, the Indian Governor General Lord Mountbatten established the Southeast Asia Command to push the Japanese out of Southeast Asia. The word didn't exist. There was India, there was China, there was Japan, there was Indochina. But I think this very compartmentalized thinking about Asia, that I think is going to go, because I think as India, as the subcontinent, becomes more economically dynamic, the nature of its historic connections with the rest of Asia are going to grow. And I think India and South Asia, located at the center of the Indian Ocean, at the crossroads of Asia, and if anyone who looks at the map of OBOR today can see both the maritime one and the land one actually go around South Asia, and both are going to touch South Asia. So South Asia is not apart from the rest of Asia. And I think what happens in South Asia is going to affect the rest of the region. And if you go back to the Second World War, it was the South Asian resources. It was undivided India's military resources that helped defeat Japanese. In fact, nearly 1 million Indian troops marched through Burma to push the Japanese out, took the surrender of the Indian troops right up to Hanoi. And Mr. Obama's grandfather was also part of that campaign, because we also got all the Kenyans and whoever was around who could speak English into the campaign. And I think it's important to remember those connections. And it's also important that it was the Indian that supplies to Chinese government in Chongqing were being done from India. And it was an American general who built a road called General Stilwell, connecting South Asia to China to supply the Chinese government, nationalist government, to fight the Japanese. So I think even 70 years ago, it was a different story, and I think we need to remember that, and that's why South Asia is going to be important. Coming to this specifically of the recommendations that we make in South Asia, to talk about retrenchment in abstract, what happens to NATO, what happens to US-Japan alliance, what happens to US-Korea, MOCA is going to nuclear, all the stuff we talked about. But there is an immediate test to American endurance in the region, that is in Afghanistan. $1 trillion and 12 years of war later, 15 now, 15 years later, is the US going to stick around? What is the US going to do? I mean, Mr. Obama postponed the decision of withdrawal from Afghanistan till 2016. Now, the new president will have to deal with the question, is the US going to find a way of ensuring that Afghanistan remains a stable place, or is simply going to say, turn its back a second time and say we have nothing to do with it? So I think this is going to be the test case, because a failure of the US or a clear sense of American retreat will come from Afghanistan, assuming if they do it, and the consequence of it, what it does to Islamist extremism and other forces that are going to be unleashed, everyone is going to suffer the consequence of that. So that is the first part. So don't abandon Afghanistan is a major recommendation. The second thing we're saying in relation to South Asia is that the US must now construct an India-centered strategy for the region. Until now, I mean, we've seen the US in the last 20 years. I think one of the good things of the bipartisan nature of the last 20 years has been in relation to India. Both the administrations have supported expanded relationship. But I think today the scope and agenda of that relationship will have to be increased to So if you're talking about a rearrangement, what I mentioned, if there is going to be more burden sharing, I think probably India is ripe today to take more burdens for regional security and for regional integration, which is where I think the new possibilities which we need to look at. The third thing that brings me a recommendation is to One Belt, One Road. Is probably one of the most sweeping initiatives that we are seeing, expansive, dramatic, significant, but not everyone is happy with it. The Japanese don't like it, the Indians are not sure whether it is strategic or economic. Sri Lanka has discovered that the costs of the Chinese infrastructure support. So I think there are questions being raised. What we argue in this report is that the US must encourage Japan to do more, Japan and India, to take leadership in providing an alternative proposals to what the Chinese are doing. This is not to counter the Chinese, but I think some of the terms of the Chinese projects are extraordinarily demanding, and the costs of that Chinese capital are so high that I think if there is a better framework for expanding connectivity and regionalism by Japan, supported by US and India, I think that will improve the leverage of every single country in the region. That is, in fact, it is not going to be eliminate the Chinese, but I think Sri Lankans, the Bangladeshis, Filipinos, everyone will be able to better negotiate with the Chinese, better terms for expanding our infrastructure. So let me conclude here by saying that I think for South Asia at least, we're not pessimistic. We hope that the retrenchment and rearrangement is going to produce new outcomes, new partnerships in the region, which will help strengthen at least some of the core interests that the US has, and many of which are shared by India. So I think I'll stop here, Steve.
So I mainly study Indian domestic politics, and for anybody interested in Indian domestic politics, there are very interesting parallels between the election of Mr. Modi and Mr. Trump. You have in each case somebody who brought terror into academic circles, who was seen as a deeply threatening, unsettling, disruptive figure by many of the traditional academic and intellectual elites. And then there's been a period of substantial adjustment in the past couple of years as Indians have got used to thinking maybe it's not so bad. In some ways, and I guess we can hope that maybe a couple of years from now we'll be here saying maybe it's not so bad. They're both populist leaders. Mr. Modi has got into some trouble with some of his research agenda because he is a very hands-on leader, somebody that isn't a natural delegator, and that's something that worked extremely well for him in state government before he became a prime minister. But Delhi is a lot bigger, a lot more unwieldy, and trying to bring about change using those same kind of techniques is a lot more difficult to do in the rambunctious federal politics of Delhi with lots of different ministries. So one question I think that we need to ask ourselves domestically is whether Trump is a Modi or is he a delegator? Is he going to take direct control, or is he actually going to substantially delegate some large part of foreign policy? And then I think a second question that comes up is whether he is, in the campaign, had a sort of interesting mix of lots of statements that said we need to retreat. The exact opposite of what this very good report is arguing. This report is full of nuanced recommendations about continued engagement with lots of specific policy ideas about how exactly to engage with the different countries that we're studying. But the majority, I would say, of Trump's comments during the campaign were to do with retreat. Let other people pay for their own security. Let the US do less than it's been doing. We've been a sucker, and we need to do less. That's mixed in with some statements that say we need to intervene and stand up to China. We need to stand up to unfair trade. But the majority, I would say, of the comments during the campaign have been on domestic issues, as Professor Nathan said, but also in the foreign sphere on the idea that we need to retreat a bit. So I will just talk about a couple of South Asian instances where I think retreat is likely to happen, and maybe a couple of others where I think you're likely to see some intervention. Most policies aren't going to be all one thing, retreat or intervention. You're likely to see a mix. In retreat, I think, as far as South Asia is concerned, there's going to be much less of an interest in deep engagement in South Asian security than we've seen under the previous regime, certainly than we saw after 9/11. So Mr. Rajamohan wrote a very interesting op-ed recently in an Indian newspaper just in the past week, and he said, well, it might not be so bad for India if we're not the linchpin of an American-led some balancing effort coalition within South Asia, that India itself could potentially, due to this disruption, have to think anew about what a different kind of coalition might look like in the region and construct its own strong coalition. And one interesting question for the audience to consider, and perhaps if he has time for him to talk about, is what exactly that might look like. A second interesting area, I think, if we're thinking about retreat, is the issue of the environment. So Indians, in Delhi especially, have been coughing their way through the fall. I just saw a friend recently who's back from a few weeks there. He feels permanently as if he's run a marathon and he's in the last mile, because the environment and the environmental tragedy of India's large cities has been brought forward to them this fall in a way that it has never been brought home before. And it seems pretty clear that one thing that will happen is the US will walk back from some of its commitments and international obligations on climate change. And one big question is whether in India and a lot of other countries which are so important to solving the overall issue of climate change, whether this will basically reduce the political support in a broad-based way for continuing with their own initiatives and treaty obligations. And I think that's a very worrying prospect, not just for those of us in the US, but you know, for anyone living anywhere, especially in low-lying islands. So those are a couple of instances where I think retreat is going to be a very interesting issue. Now, in terms of intervention, trade is obviously a big issue. India is a huge supplier of software services in particular, but a lot of other service exports to the US. And there's been a lot of talk about unfair trade, your Indians on H-1B visas being brought over to fulfill the work of people here. So that's a potential really serious area of friction that we're looking at. In this case, though, I think that the US's need for India as a balance against Pakistan, as a balance against China, are basically going to be sufficient that push comes to shove, you won't see significant trade war between India and the US on those kinds of issues. And then there's one final issue where I think you might see retreat. The US, I think, is going to be doing less in Afghanistan, and its move away from Pakistan as an ally will accelerate. So I was reading earlier on today some of the WikiLeaks from Ambassador Bolton back in the mid-2000s, and it's clear that there's a deep skepticism on his part about Pakistan's real commitment to be on team with the US. Regardless of who's appointed, I think you're going to see a much harder attitude to Pakistan, and the move that's already happened is going to accelerate. And that can only be probably in India's interest as we go on. So I'll stop there and see if, Roger, you want to... Should we go to the next country, or should he respond? Okay.
Next country, thank you. Next region will be Southeast Asia. Look, first I would like to encourage participants to have a look at the report. It has a number of details and recommendations and so on. But this is not a time this evening to go over minute issues about what the US should do, about soft power projection, to exercise its activities. But please have a look at the report. Here, I think we're talking about main contours and approaches and directions. So I have 4 points. I had 3 earlier, but since Raja had 4, I'll have 4 now. We've been on this trip together, 3 of us, over 3 days. And we have had a consensus, even though we did this work separately, different regions. But we actually have a common view now that the US should remain engaged, different circumstances in different ways, work with allies and so on, which I'll come to. Over the last 3 days, I also have encountered that there is a consensus in Washington and New York that people in these two places don't like Donald Trump. Professor Lee introduced us with two key words I take away, that you have to remain vigilant to ensure that the new administration is prudent. So I want to apologize to say that I'm Trump neutral. In fact, in Southeast Asia, there's been a cautious optimism that greets the Trump's rise. If you look around, Duterte, Hun Sen, General Prayut in Thailand, Najib, they actually have welcome. And you have a democracy here. There's a democratic outcome. It doesn't look good for America to stand up for democracy around the world when it doesn't respect its own democracy at home. So just to say that a new administration for us is a new opportunity to see a new U.S. role compared to the last 8 years in Southeast Asia and other regions, South Asia and Northeast Asia. Had it been a different administration, the opposing, we would have seen probably more continuity. And we had a kind of a implicit assumption that this would happen. This is what we had, this report, this work. But a lot has happened in the last 5 months. With the Trump administration, I think there will be more change than continuity. There will always be both. There will be some qualitative change. This means that things will be, I think, a lot better for US-Asia relations or a lot worse. But probably not more of the same. And that, I think, has generated some excitement in Southeast Asia about, well, what is Trump going to do? If Hillary, we know kind of what she's going to do, more or less. But Trump, no idea. He's a complete unknown. That makes it a little bit exciting, but disconcerting, also a bit apprehensive. So that's the first thing I want to say. There's a new chance for the reshaping, refashioning of US-Asia ties, certainly in Southeast Asia. For Southeast Asia, second point, the US has been losing the region, so-called. And it's a little bit counterproductive, counterintuitive, because it should not be losing the region. The basis, the rationale, and drivers of the Obama pivot and rebalance was really about Southeast Asia. Asia more broadly, but Southeast Asia he had in mind. He showed up, but he went to Southeast Asia 7 times, visited 7 times for all the summits, pretty much. And President Obama showed up. Part of the game in Southeast Asia is showing up for these summits. They like to have meetings. There's like over 1,000 meetings that ASEAN conducts every year, and every day there's some kind of multiple meetings. But some meetings, if you don't show up, they take it as an insult. You're not, part of the team, or you're neglecting, ignoring. So President Obama did a lot on a personal level. He's very popular. He has a lot of personal appeal. He's good with people. I think he has charm, charisma, connection. But on a policy level, his pivot and rebalance fell short. When the pivot and rebalance developed, we can see that China has been at the other end. So in the maritime domain, in the South China Sea, China took over Scarborough Shoal in April 2012. Nothing happened to China. China is, it occupies Scarborough Shoal. And then it proceeded to take over these reefs and rocks that it built, converted into artificial islands with landing strips, with tourist facilities. And then nothing happened. The Philippines did take China to court, the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague. And eventually, after 3 years, the PCA ruled in the Philippines' favor, overwhelmingly. China violated Philippine sovereignty, damaged the maritime environment, has no historical rights to these claims. But China continues to remain, on these artificial islands. So it's China for keeps now, these islands. And then nothing has happened. There's no enforcement of the PCA ruling. The U.S. has said, okay, you should abide by international law, but the U.S. is not even a signatory to the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS. The U.S. does conduct its FONOPS, freedom of navigation, operational patrols, and it has some naval vessels in the area now and then, but not much more than that. So President Duterte, on taking office, he saw through this, and he's a little bit like Trump. If Modi is Trump, Duterte is also a bit Trumpish. Maverick, unconventional, anti-establishment, and he's first from the outside, an outsider who defied the ruling families and got elected. So he went straight to China to deal with it directly, because China is at his front door, and there's no one to help him. No one to help the Philippines. PCA can only make a ruling. And then he came away with some, I think, a deal. But had he done that without going to Japan, he would have been ill-advised, naive, maybe disillusioned, or manipulated by China. But he also went to Japan. And this trend that you can see, and my colleagues have mentioned earlier, Japan is filling in the gap where the U.S. used to do the hitting. So, this is a chance now for the United States to, with a new administration, to get a new ball game, have a new game plan. And we are watching very carefully who is going to come up and the names that come up. And all these names are, I know you have a lot of feelings with these names. I know I read the papers, so I'm familiar with the names. But it doesn't matter. If the name comes up, Secretary of State, deputies, assistant secretaries, that's what we're looking at. And then we're looking at policies and orientation, approach, and actually some kind of a backup. The Obama pivot rebalance in the end was, I don't want to say empty, but it was certainly at least shallow. It didn't have a lot of follow-through. So maybe this is a chance to remix, rethink the rebalance, perhaps recalibrate American interests and American values. If you look around Southeast Asia, American values have a hard time getting through because of authoritarian regimes or authoritarian ways in democratic regimes or electoral regimes with authoritarian tendencies. So in Thailand there's a coup, and Thailand has for a long time a beloved king. After 70 years he passed away. So the military has taken over. The military has been in power for a while. So if the Obama administration goes and say, hey, restore democracy, watch human rights, have election as soon as you can, and then there's a box to check for them. Well, Thailand is a treaty ally. Thai-US relations are on the rocks, have been on the rocks over the past several years. The Philippines, similar. US treaty ally, relations are a bit antagonistic now. This is not to say the US should go around and embrace authoritarian regimes and abandon human rights and democracy, but it can also have more nuances and a more optimal mix of engaging while making warnings, certainly, saying the right things about what constitutes American identity, basic freedoms, fundamental freedoms, and all of that, but not at the expense of other interests of engagement. And Japan has been doing some of this. Japan, very clever. I've been a big fan of Japan lately. So we have a military regime in Thailand, right? Facing Western ostracism, criticism, had to go to Beijing. It went a lot of bilateral exchanges with Beijing, culminating with visits. And in the end, when the Chinese came back with terms of development, infrastructure, and so on, it was seen as a rip-off. It was tough, short repayment period, high interest rates. So they went to Japan. General Prayut, the coup maker, prime minister, went to Japan by February 2015, after going to Beijing in late 2014, and came away with some Japanese support, Japanese funding for rail development projects. So it's, again, China and Japan in the mix. And Japan is keen to engage in this fashion. But Japan also got General Prayut to say that there will be election in Thailand, that the election roadmap and return to democracy is on track. Now, if it's a little bit delayed, I don't think the Japanese are unhappy. Eventually there will be elections in Thailand. But you can also say, similar stories in, say, Malaysia, Philippines. Overall, I think that this is a new opportunity now to get a new game in America, abroad. Maybe the U.S. doesn't have to play a leading role. We can play a supporting role, complementary role in some places. In some other areas, a leading role. It can be a mix of roles, but not a kind of a detached, a big rhetorical footwork, but not a lot of follow-through. I was thinking of sports analogy. Your country likes sports. So, I mean, in basketball, I think you have a six-man role. Sometimes you don't have to be a starting lineup, but you can be a six-man in basketball. I was thinking of pinch hitting in the baseball, perhaps, a little bit at times. Football, I don't know, maybe a tight end safety or something, but you don't have to always be the quarterback, right? You can also be some other team member. And I think Japan has been very demonstrative of its keenness and objective to be at the forefront. And the game is not about containing China. It's about maintaining a right mix of balance, a regional balance, so that we can have stability, security in Southeast Asia. ASEAN itself has been divided since 2012 because of this imbalance of the regional geopolitical mix. A lot of China, ASEAN has a rough time dealing with China, so China has divided ASEAN. And now the Philippines saw that, so they have had to deal with China. So it's all the region's kind of going to China. But Japan now is back in the mix, and these countries are looking to Japan. If the U.S. can re-enter the fray, they'll look to the U.S., and we can have a more balanced regional framework, and that would be good for everybody, especially the United States. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I want to reiterate what a lot of my colleagues have said about the very rich discussion of key regional security, economic, and political issues in here. I want to follow up on some of the comments that have been made regarding this debate between neglect and engagement, because clearly one of the recommendations that comes out of particularly the report on, or the section on Southeast Asia, is to have a long-term, sustained, coherent policy towards the region. And I think we would all like to see that. And I think it's also very unlikely. Southeast Asia, of all three of the regions discussed here, is clearly lowest on the U.S. foreign policy priority. It is the one that suffers from neglect the most. As Jay indicated, part of the U.S. pivot was to rebalance not just to Asia away from the Middle East, but within Asia away from Northeast Asia towards South, and it was a maritime strategy trying to link the Pacific and the Indian Oceans with Southeast Asia's strategic sea lanes of communication smack dab in the middle. And so this issue that kind of Andy raised, is neglect kind of good or bad? There is always consensus among my Southeast Asian colleagues that they want more attention, and yet they want the sustained kind of attention that does not lead to knee-jerk reaction. But outside of the Southeast Asia or the South China Sea issue, where the key U.S. interest in the region is freedom of navigation, it doesn't have strong treaty allies. I mean, our relations with the Philippines and Thailand are not good. Our relations with our strategic partners like Singapore are better. So therefore, policy tends to be reactive. And when you get too much attention, you do get a lot of the kind of values-driven knee-jerk reaction that tends to cause problems in the relationship. So there is a way in which neglect can sometimes be a bit more benign. And I realize that this goes against the grain, but if we look at many of the blow-ups in U.S. Southeast Asian relations over the years, it's been because events, whether it be policy issues towards Duterte, what have you, really spin out of control. And I also want to focus on this issue of engagement and how we engage. You said that the pivot has left, promised a lot and delivered little. I would argue that if it had three components, the TPP is the economic component, the military component. The third component was this embrace of multilateralism. My colleague from Northeast Asia talked about ASEAN, right, as the key institution in the region. And this was a major shift under Obama, was his real embrace of ASEAN signing the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation, sending high-levels delegations, being the first country to appoint a U.S. ambassador or to appoint an ambassador to ASEAN as an institution. And that policy was backed up, as you indicate, with one of the most precious commodities in Washington, the president's time. He showed up every year besides the 1 year when the government was closed. That was huge. But as you also noted, Jay, showing up was important for symbolic reasons, right? And it really raises this question of, are we likely to see this under a President Trump who's very, I would assume, going to take a much more transactional approach to foreign policy? And he'll then be asking, okay, ASEAN, what benefits are you delivering to me? And I think that they're going to have a hard time with that, right? Let's not forget that traditionally Republicans have been much less warm towards ASEAN. During the Bush administration, Condoleezza Rice skipped a whole slew of ASEAN meetings, arguing that there was no concrete outputs. It was a waste of time. And so I think that there's going to be a real challenge here, quite frankly, for ASEAN to really make the case. And I say that because there's a lot of discussion in the report about the division that my colleague discussed within ASEAN over the South China Sea issue, over strategic visions, particularly between the maritime and mainland Southeast Asian countries. And quite frankly, China has pretty much bought off Cambodia to act as its proxy, sometimes Laos, so that we're not seeing ASEAN play that driver's role. And a prerequisite for ASEAN being a strong actor that can, as the report would like to see, kind of play a role in moderating the relations between the other great powers, is to have a common interest, a common vision, a common agenda around which it can then seek consensus from the other countries that, you mentioned, Japan, Australia. And in the absence of that, the question is, with whom are you really engaging? And I think that that's going to be a really, really big challenge in the next administration. Another theme that comes out of the report and was touched on a little earlier was that the region wants to be engaged for itself. It doesn't want to just be engaged as a pawn to contain China, right? So it wants to be separated from that. And I think that can be, it's very understandable. But again, as I noted, the key strategic interest of the U.S. in that region is the South China Sea. And that's where China is really challenging the status quo. It's challenging, you mentioned Scarborough Shoal, all of the other claimant countries, and it's challenging international law. And I think it's also important to note that, quite frankly, although Duterte has done a 180, clearly the previous Filipino administration actively sought U.S. engagement for their positions. So did Vietnam. Lots of countries have lobbied the U.S. to take a stand. So it does kind of put, I think, the U.S., in this almost catch-22. We want you to take a stand, back our interests, but from a distance, a little bit, don't put us in the middle. And I think that that's been, I don't want to say, that's been a mode of operandi. And I think given China's challenge to the South China Sea issue, that's going to become much more difficult, and it would have become much more difficult regardless of who was president. I think on that note, I will end. Thank you.
Well, as you can see, it's been a tremendous privilege to spend time with and listen to my Asian colleagues. I am the other Ellen. Ellen Leibson, co-chair, was unable to be here, as was Harry Harding, but I did take part in the discussions as a member of the U.S. team, and I'm going to put on that hat and sharing my remarks with you. I'm going to say something briefly about the tone of sort of our discussions and the kinds of things that were kind of in the air. I'm going to pick out then 5 areas where we really agreed across the board. And then I'm going to say something about the issues that have been already covered, but I'll add a little bit there. Then I'll say something about opportunities for the United States looking forward. And finally, I'll throw out some unresolved questions that might be useful for your debate. The tone really was one of urgency, partly because of the Trump victory, but partly because Asia itself is changing so fast. So there was a tone that Asia isn't going to wait, it's moving on. And we use the word recalibrate a lot. That just sort of came up in our discussions, that we, the United States, need to recalibrate some of our approaches. There's a lot of uncertainty on both sides, and that was very clear. And one of the things that surprised me a little bit, but I got converted by my colleagues here, was this cautious optimism. You heard some of it just now, that when we talked about Hillary Clinton bringing baggage, we were talking about her email issue and Bill Clinton and stuff like that. She also had foreign policy baggage as seen by Asians, whereas Mr. Trump is a blank slate, and that presented some opportunities. So that was kind of a surprise for some of us that in the gloom and doom camp to see that there might be some positive aspects of this election. So the five of the agreed items, and there was a lot of consensus in our deliberations, was first, obviously, the need for ongoing U.S. engagement. We've discussed that. The second was on how central the U.S.-China relationship is. And here, I think we all agreed that we wanted a Goldilocks option, not a G2 that was going to try to rule Asia, and not on the other extreme, open conflict, and especially not military conflict with China, but something in the middle. And that's always been a difficult relationship to handle, given Taiwan, given the South China Sea, given a whole bunch of other things. But that comes up as repeatedly in almost any discussion about politics and security in the region. There was some thought that since Xi Jinping is himself seemingly transactional, and Donald Trump is transactional, maybe they'll make some deals, but what would that mean for the rest of Asia? There was some thought about, I don't know that we've agreed exactly that the United States is losing Asia, but there was certainly some feeling among all of us that although U.S.-China relations shouldn't be seen as zero-sum across the board, there was definitely a shift that was sort of leaned in China's favor, and that the United States had been sort of passive and suffering setbacks. The failures include, or the setbacks include, the TPP, failure to ratify the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. We, who are the great leaders supposedly in free trade and rule of law and so forth, are not ratifying either of those. The negative attitude towards the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank was a big foreign policy mistake. And so we can go on with that, but we above all, well, maybe not above all, but among various governments, we certainly failed to take account of the strength and anger and frustration of the people left behind by globalization. That's not unique to the United States, but we paid a price for not paying attention to this group of people, and not just Democrats, the nation as a whole. Finally, Japan came out loud and clear as growing in influence, something that's been welcomed by the United States, whether it's pushing the limits of Article 9, or developing the Partnership for Quality Initiative. Japan is, after all, known for quality infrastructure work, or whether it's Mr. Abe's personal diplomacy. All of these things add up to a much greater role for Japan in the region, and one that the Americans at least welcome, and I think the others do too. Another point of consensus was that India does belong in the East Asia slash Southeast Asia political arena. And when we're talking about this, I remember writing a short article called "Why India Belongs in the East Asian Summit." The reason for including India in all of these discussions is more manifest than ever. So these were all, I think, points of agreement. With respect to the issues, the main issues are old. I mean, how many times have I heard burden sharing starting from my years as a Senate staffer in the 1970s, right? How many years have I heard Asians worry about U.S. commitment, because when your security guarantor is thousands of miles away, you're going to be nervous. Some of these issues are very old, about how do you treat burden sharing, how do you treat allies, but they've become really quite acute, very acute, which contributes to this sense of urgency that I began with. It's important to realize that our allies are a huge strategic asset, even if we have major bumps in the road. As someone who worked in the Pentagon, I can tell you that even when political relationships are bad, sometimes the mill-mill relationships continue to be very strong. These are people who have trained together and know each other and to some extent trust each other. Military people tend to like American weapons. They tend to want to participate in PACOM exercises and bilateral training and so forth. So there may be sort of different layers in which our relationships are both weakened and continue to be strong. It's not something you hear about. On the general link between the allies, the link between security and economic issues, I think Minister Yoon expressed it perfectly, and I certainly endorse that. On the economic side, we've already covered pretty much the anti-globalization mood, the failure to ratify ratify TPP and so forth. I'll venture some guesses about the future of rebalancing, and I come out quite close to where Anne-Marie just did. If you think of the rebalancing policy as having sort of three pillars, my pillars would be the geographic emphasis, greater priority to Asia Pacific. My answer is maybe. I mean, who knows who's going to be the Assistant Secretary of State and so forth. That's a question mark. Second element of the rebalance was more priority attention to Southeast Asia. I don't see that happening in the Trump administration. Again, maybe, but probably not. And then a better balance between economic and military instruments. That really was a big part of the rebalancing strategy explicitly. And there, of course, the failure to ratify TPP is disastrous, because TPP is the main pillar, and all of the other things like the expanded economic engagement with poorer ASEAN countries, the E3 so-called, it's peanuts in terms of funding. So on the whole, the support for regionalism and regional institutions, as Anne-Marie said, might also slip, because the George W. Bush administration considered these things talk shops. I personally think if you didn't have ASEAN, you'd have to reinvent it, and I think the same of the ASEAN-supported institutions, but it may take the Trump administration a while to figure that out. Whatever it is, it's going to have a Trump name on it, and then it will be okay. Who knows what it's going to be. Okay, briefly, opportunities for the United States. I think there was varying degrees of the damage done, but we all agree that it really is not too late for the United States to regain some of its leadership role, at least, provided, with certain provisos. We need to be more nuanced, more modest. We need to realize how bad some of the aspects of our political society look like these days, and without giving up our values and our advocacy, we need to be careful not to be lecturing to people or taking unduly extreme policies as Titanan just mentioned about Thailand. It seems also that we need resources to put behind whatever it is we're doing, because we talk a big talk, but we don't deliver the resources. We don't seem to have a consistent strategy, and we don't always have a consistent commitment to the policies that we do have in Asia. Although I think there's quite a lot of continuity, we need to reinforce that. With those kind of caveats, I think the United States could play an ongoing leadership role of some sort, maybe not as number one, but as in other roles. There are tremendous opportunities for soft infrastructure. I mean, tremendous. We all talk about infrastructure in the hard sense, you know, the dams, the big, huge port modernization things. We can't, as a government, put up the resources for that. But the soft infrastructure that it takes to run these things, we have enormous strengths. The whole digital economy, the whole IT aspect of running modern infrastructure projects. There's a whole lot that needs to be done. Energy, water treatment at some of these sites. I mean, all kinds of things that we can participate in. And then there's the human infrastructure. If you think about the 50s and 60s, we had the Fulbright program. We had huge numbers of students coming. We could quintuple or increase those programs 20 times over, and it still wouldn't cost very much. The same with English language training in Asian countries. There's no reason we can't do a whole lot more of that. Doesn't offset, you know, South China Sea reefs and islands, but it's something. It's important, and the report says this, to make an early commitment to a high-level visit. Remember, Secretary of State Clinton's first visit was to Asia as Secretary of State. We need things like that. We need showing up, as Obama did regularly. And eventually, as the report says, the Trump administration really should revisit TPP and continue to strengthen the international economic order that has served most of the countries in Asia so well. So finally, just some unresolved questions to toss out to you, either because we just didn't have time to discuss them, or they only came up in one or two cases. One is Russia. You heard some tonight that we haven't really figured that one out yet. Another one is well, okay, our response to the South China Sea has been inadequate, but what do we do? Do we shoot people? Do we drop bombs on these things? If the freedom of navigation operations aren't enough, as some people say, what else should we be doing? That's a question for you. How should we handle the emphasis on human rights, democracy, and governance? If we're not going to lecture people, okay, how are we going to make those things compatible with the other interests that we're pursuing? And then finally, my eyes glaze over when I hear the word architecture. What architecture do we need in Asia? Because I think it's a reflection of underlying politics. But on second thought, you know, as Minister Yoon said, in fact, all the speakers have said this basically, we need institutional reform. We need to have our institutions reflect the changing power relationships. And how are we, the United States, going to handle these institutions or propose new ones when we are not the obvious number one player? So with that, I will stop. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Xiaobo Liu. I'm Professor of Political Science at Barnard College and also at Weatherhead East Asia Institute. So my job is to sort of moderate and synthesize first what we have heard and then open up for questions afterwards. So two things we hear, the two concerns that expressed here throughout the subregions, all, you know, eight speakers here, and that is between sort of neglect or retrenchment and engagement, and more active engagement versus this kind of possible retrenchment or overcome the neglect that has been exist. So out of these two concerns or two factors, then we hear from the left to right is seemingly from more pessimistic to more optimistic. If you hear this, you know, if that's what we hear. So Northeast Asia, the worry is that, again, I want to use our Thailand scholars, you know, usage of a game, you know, a sports game. So for Northeast Asia, what I hear is that the game is pretty good. You know, U.S. is just about right. We're playing a good game. So we're worrying that somehow there's a new game coming in and they throw out the old game and sort of status quo, and then we worry. We worry that either this game would be, this new game may not be a good game. South Asia is something like, okay, so the game was, you know, South Asia was kind of outside the game, India was outside the game, and now we're seeing possibility of South Asia being part of the new game. Maybe it's good, we don't know, but let's say it's a change is not too bad. The change might be good. Southeast Asia, on the other hand, is saying sort of the game wasn't good to begin with. You know, there was what could be worse than a kind of a failed pivot. So let's try a new game. You know, it has to be better game, right? So that's a kind of the kind of optimism or pessimism I hear. So my question really for each of this sort of small pairs or regions is this: for Dr. Yun, Andy Nathan talk about these two possible postures. One is the neglect by the U.S. The other is more of a simple solution, a quick fix, which kind of ignore this complexity of Northeast Asia. So what makes you more optimistic? So you're the pessimist, you're expressing what's the possible optimism, optimistic kind of factor that you think might be out of this new administration, right? Is it the possible that there's some engagement or some possibility of cooperation this transactional president might have with China on Northeast Asia, on the North Korea nuclear issues, or something else? You know, you talk about economics and so on. So I wonder if you can. And for South Asia, I think Dr. Wickens already raised the question for Dr. Mohan. Is that what makes you think that this possibly a good change? What worries you? Is this sort of a populist president like Modi and Trump, obviously? Would this would be something that what worries you? You talk about the possible new restructuring or new ordering, but what would that new ordering or new arrangement be that may not all good to India, South Asia in the whole overall picture? For Southeast Asia, I think Anne-Marie pointed out that United States already, maybe we think this pivot wasn't quite successful, but at least the Obama administration has done certain things. But it's not U.S. that can be completely blamed for that failed game, if you will, right? So what worries you, if anything? Again, I want to sort of throw a lot of counter-intuitive questions. So is that new game necessarily better than the old game? How could that be? Is it transactional President Trump that, as Anne-Marie said, that what will ASEAN do for me, right? If I do something in return, why should I put more emphasis in more supporting ASEAN vis-a-vis China? So that's the question I raise, and then give you a chance to answer, and then we'll open up to the floor.
Thank you very much. Not only each question to me, I mean, what kind of positive factor we can find from transition to Donald Trump administration. Probably, I hope, his concern on the cost aspect of alliance relationship between the United States on the one hand and South Korea, Japan on the other may lead to transformation of U.S. perspective on institutional framework in that region. What I'm saying is, for example, in Europe, in Asia, security arrangement was based on hub and spoke model, so-called, which was created about 70 years ago. Nowadays, East Asia is totally different world compared to the 70 years ago. And we need to strengthen our institutional mechanism by adding some kind of multilateral factor over there. For example, those spoke countries like South Korea or Japan, they didn't have their own institutional channel to communicate with which they can solve some kind of history issues or territorial issues or something like that. So I think his transactional approach on international issue will lead to rethinking about reforming of framework, security framework there. For example, in Europe, they have NATO, which is alliance, but at the same time they have multilateral institutional mechanisms like OSCE. So why not try that kind of format in East Asia?
I think on what worries me, as I said, I think what is exciting or what is optimism is that, look, that change allows you to rethink your assumptions. The political line that Trump has taken or Bernie Sanders has taken or others have taken has had an academic component, right? Those like Barry Posen or Stephen Walt, realists have argued that, look, the present path of America cannot be sustained, that you can construct a more restrained, structured policy that is more prudent, more careful, and that in the long term that is sustainable. So in that sense, Trump's argument, US should not be the global policeman, US should stop nation building, allies should pay more, actually provides a basis for constructing a more interesting foreign policy because of the last 25 years, what you learned, you can on that basis you can do something different. But what complicates this, of course, history is not written by political scientists, professors. There are individuals, all kinds of individuals who run countries and governments. So I think unpredictability, that while transactional, I have no problem with transactional, that means you can actually negotiate deals. But if it's unpredictability, incoherence, and peremptory actions, like if we decide to withdraw from Afghanistan, look, it's no longer important, then you have problems. Another thing is, I think, what worries everyone, I think, is this, that for the first time, the autonomy of the foreign policy elite has shrunk. That the US domestic politics, there are people who are saying, look guys, you had a free run, New York and Washington, but there are other people who have other interests which are not being met. And I think that induces a systemic instability. I think the way US relates to the world, I think most of the problems and pessimism or fears come from that.
Yes, the game has changed, which is to say that the status quo has changed in Southeast Asia. And when this happened, roughly from about 2012, maybe a little bit before. So, once China takes over Scarborough Shoal, it changes the status quo. Occupies reefs and rocks and made into artificial islands. And then losing the PCA decision and just ignoring international ruling. So this is a new game, new ball game. And the Southeast Asian countries see it, and they're playing along because go to Beijing, but also go to Tokyo. And Tokyo is playing this game. Tokyo is fully in the game. The US, not out, but it's just at the margins. It's still, and I don't blame Obama administration per se. It has a lot of preoccupations, a lot of domestic constraints. I think in the first term, there was a lot of momentum. Second term, it didn't quite take its eye off the ball, but it just, there were other balls to play in other areas. But now there's an opportunity to re-enter. I do think that this transactional emphasis that you brought up is crucial. So, to what extent are we going to see President Trump, an artful deal maker, right? He's like the deal maker. He likes deals. And when you like deals, it's not going to be multilateral. Deals are normally bilateral. So I think there's a risk that we would worry about, that he does not take a multilateral view, that ASEAN, he'll be dismissed because ASEAN likes to have meetings and the results are very slow, it's process driven, and maybe he'll just say, why bother? There's no deal. And that's something that we're watching very carefully. On the other hand, I noticed that maybe maybe the aura of office and the various imperatives of office will entice, persuade, even require him to be, a real international statesman of some kind.
So let's open up for the floor and identify yourself and also tell us which question, which panelist you're addressing to. Be brief. Yeah, that's the one.
Hi. My name is Renee. I represent the LaRouche political movement, and I just wanted to make a little clear on what the distinctions are that we're talking about, which is,
Is it a question or statement? You want to ask a question?
Yes.
Okay.
The question is really what's not being discussed, which is a matter of world war or not. And I think what the discussion should be like now towards space development with China, which has been a proposal made to the United States, and along with the New Silk Road, One World, One Belt, One World. So my question to the panelists, whoever wants to discuss this, is should that be a thing the U.S. and China should do, go back to space to avoid World War?
Do you mean cooperation in the aerospace?
Moon.
Anyone want to take on it? Andy? Take a few questions? Oh, yeah, let's take a few questions and then we'll answer. Okay, here. In the middle here. That one gentleman first and then talk about.
Hello, Nick Reinhold. I'm studying security policy. For Professor Wilkinson, I think when the new administration is confronted with the nuclear issues with Pakistan, do you think they'll have a rude awakening and then realize that Pakistan is an essential partner due to the importance of some of the issues, and then also the partnership on the counterterrorism and the counterinsurgency issue? Thank you.
Technical? Yeah. Yeah, I know, but here.
Hi, I'm Takako Hikotani. I'm visiting professor here at Columbia teaching Japanese politics. I'm sure that if Prime Minister Abe, who's here in New York today to meet with President Trump tomorrow, will be very happy to hear people saying that Japan is back, and that there seems to be some expectation for Japan to step up in the region. But my question is, what kind of stepping up would actually be stabilizing for the region? Because I think Professor Yu mentioned how the Northeast Asia is still in somewhat of a security dilemma situation. And related to that, I noticed that in the summary of the report that you passed out, that there's a reference to the freedom of navigation operations, and it says encourage the participation of other countries such as Australia and India, but Japan is not mentioned, although that's something that's an idea that's been floated. So my question is this some kind of a sign of awareness about the way in which Japan could or maybe step up, which could be destabilizing for the region?
Yeah. One more question and then another round. Yeah, question there.
I would like to ask all our panelists to make your take and your assessment and whether or not you like the idea of forming a so-called Indo-Pacific Security Cooperation Organization, including all the relevant members, and with the United States, China, Russia, Japan, Southeast Asia, India, rotating chairmanship within this organization, having various subcommittees, subcommittee on counterterrorism, subcommittee on trying to provide good offices or mediation to resolve territorial disputes, and various other subcommittees. And with each power contributing financial resources in accordance with the GDP of that power as a percentage of the total, and the various other factors such as population, military size, and the formula can change with the change in the balance power. and to set up.
Okay,
that
we
organization.
have no time to get into details.
Yeah,
This is
just
a little
ask
bit of
for your comment.
Great.
And
Mr.
your-
Mohan, here you have your...
contribution and your ideas on this.
Okay,
To force Trump to take it.
Thank you, thank you. Whose idea, by the way, that is? Your idea, okay, all right. So here you have your rearrangement kind of order here. So let's take up this round, and then we'll leave some, and then we'll have another round.
Regarding the necessity to cooperate on global issues like development issues or space issues or something like that, I think that's natural for us to go, natural way to go for the US and China. The problem is that the trust level between those two big countries are not, sometimes are not that high. But in some areas, for example, environmental issues, I mean, they could succeed in making some agreement. And that was a good sign, but it may depend on how much pressure policymakers get from domestic sector on certain issues. Regarding the Japanese role, that's very an important question, because when I made my presentation, brief presentation, I tried to imply that Japanese role would be important in the economic sphere for the time being, but in the security field, stronger role of Japan may backfire. For example, inviting a strong resistance from Chinese side. So I think on the security side, I think Japan had better be careful, and it is better for that country to make to try to make contribution in probably less sensitive issue areas like economic interactions or something like that. That's why I told Japan may be able to contribute by sticking to the idea of TPP, even without U.S. participation. I think all the international relations, or even bilateral relations, has both aspects, cooperational aspect as well as competitive aspect. For example, even in bilateral relationship between U.S. and China, there are more than 90 high-level communication channels between two governments for mutual cooperation. So I think, I hope Japanese government try to pay more attention on the cooperational aspect between China and Japan. It seems to be, my impression is that Japan has been paying too much attention on competitive aspect or security confrontational aspect these days. So in that way, I think Japan will be able to contribute more.
Steve. Yeah. I'll just take the Pakistan question. So the question was basically whether the U.S.'s need to keep the nuclear peace in South Asia and beyond and get an ally in counterterrorism would mean that the U.S. wouldn't move away from Pakistan and would re-engage. And I think that's unlikely for several reasons. I think from the perspective of many of the likely Republican foreign policy group that haven't taken themselves out with angry letters saying Trump's a moron, and dangerous, the people who might be considered. Pakistan has been a proliferator despite engagement. It has supported terrorism despite engagement. It has subverted U.S. policy in Afghanistan despite engagement, and therefore the existing policy simply hasn't worked, and we need to try and move to something tougher because the existing one's bankrupt and is proven to be wrong.
Let me take up the Indo-Pacific issue. I mean, too unwieldy, too big to succeed. That I think at this point, the need is not for one more massive multilateral organization. I think when we developed the concept of Indo-Pacific, we were essentially making the point that China has growing strategic interest in the Indian Ocean, and that India has growing interest in the Pacific Ocean, and that the idea of seeing these two oceans as separate entities is wrong, and that there's going to be fusion. And I think all that China has done on the OBOR, China's maritime expansion, is merely proving that point. So I think it's not about creating another architecture. And the problem with architecture at this point is when great power relations are in a fundamental flux, you're not going to be able to build architecture, fresh architecture. And I think that's where ASEAN has been divided. EAS doesn't work. So what is Indo-Pacific structure going to do? Our dear Indonesian friends have proposed something like that. I see no chance for it. I think the problem is the changing great power relationship. There, I think there are a lot of areas where US and China can cooperate. Outer space, development of moon, they're working together on cybersecurity, all kinds of things are going on. But the problem is this, that the China's rise is fundamentally threatens American position in Asia. That is the crux. At 3 levels, briefly, growing Chinese military power is going to make it harder for American forward military presence for 70 years that is stuck on the first island chain. And I think that elbowing that is beginning to happen will have consequences. Second, China is probing the credibility and sustainability of American military alliances at the political level. Telling the Americans, let's do a G2, telling the neighbors, Uncle Sam is far away, he's not going to come and save you, do a deal with me, which is what's happening, as you can see in ASEAN. And third, they also have the slogan of Asia for Asians. And dear Americans, you might call yourself resident power, but sorry, you're not an Asian. So I think it is that stress, unlike in the US-Soviet case. Today, US is under pressure, under geography, under the rise of China, to be able to sustain its position. And I think that's where the problem is, not with grandiose ideas of developing moon or all that can be done, but that's not going to solve the problem of rise of China and the problems it poses for the United States' presence in Asia.
Let me follow up on that, Andy, and maybe Ellen also can chip in. So given the structural sort of a given, right, given the structural that change that it's now we're facing, how do you think that this Trump personality, as a person, would that make any difference? I think Ellen makes this interesting point about the transactional president, maybe on both sides. So could it be different? Would this new, rather than Hillary Clinton, now we'll have President Trump? Would that make the U.S.-China relations different? Could that be possible? Yeah, I mean, Andy, you want to comment, or Ellen?
I can imagine Trump goosing the American economy with infrastructure investment and debt financing, partly financed presumably.
Which is cooperation, right? You see this as two sides are draw closer in that sense?
Well, no, then I think, and investing more in the U.S. Navy and sort of countering all of the pessimism here and saying we are back, our Navy is back, our economy is back. And I think I would not expect the Chinese to then back off and say, oh, okay, then back to the status quo. I think tensions instead would simply increase. But I think that is probably less likely than Trump making a series of big mistakes early on that cause a lot of disruption in the U.S. economy and leave the U.S. weaker. I'm not too optimistic.
Okay, go ahead. Peace. Yep.
Okay. Just very quickly, I mean, there were questions that were posed. First, I would say very quickly that this is a very good intention, and I like the idea. Indo-Pacific Security Organization is even a nice acronym that goes with it, IPSO. But it just won't work because the Beijing, they would say that this is some kind of a U.S. Scheme, contrivance, concoctions, and then ASEAN would say that okay, but it has to be ASEAN-centered. If you look at APEC, it's ASEAN-centered, ARF, ASEAN plus 3 APT, EAS, ADMM plus, all ASEAN. So if there's going to be a new acronym, it has to be ASEAN-based. The question, about the World War III is a good one, but I wish you didn't tell me you were from the Lyndon LaRouche movement. But actually, this is a question that I get a lot. a lot of questions like this in Southeast Asia, in Philippines, on social media. I think if Trump wins, would there be World War III? So I think your question is, I mean, about U.S.-China. We're afraid. Just not long ago, we were afraid of a G2. If the U.S. and China gets together and a condominium, they dictate everything. We don't want that. But now I think we need a little bit more of that, just more U.S. and China. But I think that we're still far away from World War III. And then last one, just very quickly, but it's an important one, about Japan stepping up. I mean, destabilizing, up to a point, certainly, there'll be more tension. So it would be risky if Japan were to play a greater role. It is doing that now. And there's a lot of baggage, Japan, China. But in Southeast Asia, I can tell you that the Southeast Asian countries are looking for that. I mean, not for the risk for the destabilization, but for Japan to play a greater role is worth the risk. And for Japan, I think it's an imperative not to cede the area to China.
Can I just make one comment on that? Because where we are seeing Japan do so much that is welcome is in the maritime domain, particularly with regard to Coast Guard, not just provision of boats, but training, radar capacity, all of the soft infrastructure stuff that Ellen was talking about, and it's extremely welcome, and it is stabilizing at the same time.
So, okay, so this gentleman here, and I'll give that this side. Okay, so a few questions. We don't have a whole lot of time. So be concise and short. Thanks.
Thank you. I just want to refer back to Hillary Clinton's speech to Goldman Sachs, where she said that her intention was to ring China with missiles and to increase the size of the fleet in the South China Sea, which she also said could legitimately be called the American Sea. I wonder if you had any thoughts on that.
Okay.
Specifically as to your encouragement of increased U.S. involvement in the area.
Okay, so this side here, I see a student here. Okay.
Hi, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity. And my question is pretty simple. President-elect Trump has said that he has a little experience in foreign policy, and he learned most of his foreign policy from TV. And my question is, do you think his inexperience in foreign policy an advantage or disadvantage to the administration? And how would that bring some difference or new perspective to the region? Okay.
Okay, one more, yeah.
Thank you. I'm a sophomore from Barnard College. One of the policies that President-elect Trump advocated for the whole time of his campaign was to bring jobs that Asian countries stole away from American workers back to the U.S. market by moving the overseas factories back. He also wanted to build more infrastructures to provide more jobs. Do you think President-elect Trump's passion for GDP and his industrialistic dream are economically feasible and socially beneficial for America today and in the future? And do you think such policies are actually opening new prospects for Asian countries to develop their self-owned brands, consequently or unexpectedly making countries like China stronger? Thank you very much.
Interesting. One last question here. Okay, here, gentlemen. No, I have this gentleman here. Okay, sorry.
I'm Calvin Homer. When North Korea convinces the U.S. that it could launch intercontinental ballistic missiles, nuclear tipped, to hit American cities, will any American president be willing to risk American cities to defend Northeast Asia? And if not, what are the policy implications for the governments in the region?
Okay, so anyone now?
Yeah, you want me to?
Go ahead, yeah, please.
Yeah.
And then Ellen, yeah.
I think the Clinton policy of ringing with missiles or bigger navy, I think its problem is military part is only one dimension. What is the overall political strategy? That if China is not playing the same game, I mean, I think the Chinese don't have to really overmatch the American military capacity. They have to create enough complications for the Americans to operate in the Western Pacific. And second, politically undermine the basis on which the US is constructing its alliances in the region. And that's precisely what the current Chinese strategy is. And without addressing that problem, I don't think you can solve it by merely technical means, which is what the pivot was about. How many 50% of my Navy is going to operate in the Pacific? The question, I think, is this, that what is the basis on which you're going to construct a counter-coalition, assuming you need to do one in Asia? That is it going to be a US-centered, US-led, US-dominated architecture, or can the US play it with softer hands, let the regional powers, the large number of them, support their capacity to create an in situ balancing coalition? That is the challenge. But as long as the US thinks it is a control freak, it must leadership, it must lead directly and control the process, there are going to be problems. I think that's what it requires, a very different framing of what does this China's rise mean for regional balance, and what does tyranny of geography do to the American capacity to limit the Chinese power. And I think that is the bigger issue. I think inexperience is not a disqualification. Mr. Reagan didn't have much of he's today celebrated as the greatest president. So anything could happen. But the fact is there coherence? Is there competence? That is the question, and not the lack of experience. And I think that's where the problems with this administration are going to be, that does it have the capacity, does it have the competence to deliver any strategy, forget this strategy or that strategy. And lastly, the jobs issue, I think, is going to be a much bigger one. If there is the real so-called fourth industrial revolution that's beginning to unfold, the assumptions on which the Chinese economic power is built today, the American hopes for recovery or the Indian hopes for Make in India, all this could be rendered irrelevant if there is a structural change in the means of production. That if artificial intelligence, robotics, 3D printing, these are going to change the nature of economic activity, then I think we are staring at something very different. And that is going to do a lot of redistribution, just as the previous rounds of revolutions have done. I think that is a problem that we barely scraped at this point of time.
Ellen?
First of all, on the jobs issue, if you look at the decline in U.S. manufacturing jobs, you'll see that the curve began to fall steeply around 79, 80, 1981, which is when the technology revolution sort of began. And if you contrast that with the rise in productivity, the line goes just the other way at exactly the same point. So there's this myth that we don't have manufacturing anymore. That's not true. We have a manufacturing sector, and we have foreign companies investing in manufacturing, and our own companies, some of which have failed, but a lot are still around. But what I think is, so it's a mistake to think that, just zapping other countries is going to bring jobs back to the United States. If Trump tears up NAFTA, and so there's no advantage in investing in Mexico, they'll move to another country if they can. And so, this whole debate really needs a lot of clarification. I will say one or two other things quickly. This notion of a USC reminds me of not the University of Southern California, a United States Sea that I think you raised, the Pacific. I mean, of course, it's not only ridiculous, it's archaic. And the South, I've actually argued strongly that the South China Sea should not be called the South China Sea, it should be called the South Sea. ASEAN members, a few of them think it should be called the Southeast Sea. I mean, if China can own the South China Sea because it's got China in the name, then, India can own the Indian Ocean. I mean, this is just, it just doesn't make sense. Final comment, I sort of ducked Xiaobo's question about Trump and Xi Jinping. I mean, I will say that Mr. Trump does seem to have an ability to sort of talk to people the way they want to hear somehow in certain groups. Xi Jinping has a humiliation narrative from the China, a century of humiliation. That's part of it. He's afraid of Luan, of chaos, and he wants above all to centralize and deepen the role of the party and of him in particular. I think Trump may be able to sort of play with that combination in a way that's superficially at least skillful. I think when it comes to implementing whatever it is the two of them talk about, that may be a much bigger difficulty.
Thanks, Alan.
Just very quickly, I think all these, the second set of 4 questions all have to do with what will Trump do. And we don't know. And good luck to you for having to find out up close after we all go home and follow the news from afar. But I would say, Hillary Clinton did talk about greater military presence. But Trump also he wants to rebuild the Navy. And he said there's a contradiction here. If you have a lot more naval vessels, up to 350, what will you do with them? The citizens are not going to be around here in San Diego and on your coast. They have to be somewhere outside. So he hasn't made that consistent. So we will have to wait and see what he's going to do. I think reshoring will be very difficult. Bringing American, and so we'll see what his tax plan will be, what his incentives will be. But this is really going against the grain of global value chains and so on. I think the main point, going back to a kind of our sports game analogy, is really crucial for a Trump administration to don't think that you have to do everything yourself like before. Don't have to be in a lead all the time. Really work with partners, allies, and you have them now in the mix, wanting to play a greater role, like Japan and even Australia. So that's, I think, a way forward for an uncertain Trump presidency.
Dr. Yu?
Yes, North Korea is becoming more and more imminent threat to U.S. security. And especially nowadays say that in a matter of few years, North Korea will be able to miniaturize nuclear warheads, and they will be able to load on the top of long-range missile. If they succeed in achieving that kind of high-level technology in terms of miniaturizing nuclear warhead, etc., then probably U.S. government will have to take a kind of decisive action against North Korea. We hope before that kind of decisive moment comes, there should be some kind of solution between the United States and China, for example. So far, Obama administration was reluctant to apply secondary boycott against private enterprises doing business with North Korea, probably because of Chinese opposition. But if North Korea continues to develop high-level technology in terms of those nuclear threat, I think U.S. will probably take action, and I'm afraid, that kind of situation will be very dangerous. We already experienced similar situation in 1994, when North Korea wanted to develop nuclear weapons through plutonium projects. So we have not much time left to resolve that, and probably there would be some kind of solution between, arrived at by talks between U.S. and China. But the problem is China has been considering North Korea as a buffer state, and they want to continue to support in one way or another. So it's a kind of sensitive issue, even nowadays.